The legal systems of the ancient world were a strange mix of sacred duty and social control. We will uncover 21 of history's most bizarre laws, revealing the surprising logic behind rules that now seem utterly alien. You will gain a deeper understanding of how our ancestors defined justice, order, and morality. Why could a Roman father legally sell his own children? And what was the terrible price for a Mesopotamian priestess simply drinking a beer? What do you think our own laws will reveal about us to future generations? Justice was a divine whisper, not a human debate. To truly grasp the strangeness of the laws we are about to explore, you must first step into a world where the gods walked among mortals. Ancient societies did not separate church and state. Their legal codes were sacred texts, direct commands from the deities believed to control the harvest, the floods, and the very fate of the sun. A king was not merely a political leader. In places like Mesopotamia, he was the god's chosen steward. The famous Code of Hammurabi was not presented as a man-made set of rules. It was inscribed on a towering stone stele for all to see, a permanent record of laws given by the sun god Shamash to the king, establishing order and, in their view, protecting the weak from the strong. In Egypt, the pharaoh was a living god. His word was literally divine law, as unchangeable and powerful as the Nile's current. This worldview meant that every law, no matter how bizarre it seems to us, was rooted in a profound sense of cosmic necessity. A rule that forbade a certain food or mandated a specific prayer was not about preference. It was about maintaining the delicate balance of the universe, preventing chaos from swallowing the world. Survival itself depended on adhering to these divinely ordained social codes. With this sacred foundation in mind, the first peculiar law we uncover feels less like a random statute and more like a desperate plea to the heavens. That first law brings us to the very heart of Mesopotamian daily life, to a substance so vital it was both food and money: beer. In ancient Sumer, this fermented barley drink was not a luxury. It was a caloric cornerstone consumed by everyone from laborers to nobles, and it was even used to pay wages. Imagine a world where your daily bread and your paycheck could both be liquid. Because of this immense importance, the great lawgiver Hammurabi did not leave its trade to chance. His code laid out strict rules for tavern keepers, setting prices and demanding honest measures. To cheat a customer with watered-down beer was a serious crime, but one regulation stands out for its sheer, shocking severity. If a priestess, a woman dedicated to the temple, was ever caught drinking beer inside a tavern, the law demanded she be burned alive. This was not merely about punishing a person for having a drink. It was about controlling the behavior of the religious elite and protecting the sacred from the profane. A tavern was a bustling, common, and sometimes rowdy public space. For a priestess, a living representative of the gods, to be seen there was a profound violation of her sacred status. It blurred the line between the divine and the mundane, threatening the cosmic order that Hammurabi's entire code was built to uphold. Her presence in such a place was seen as an act of moral pollution, a rejection of her high station that could bring divine disfavor upon the entire community. The horrific punishment was a public, terrifying reminder that with great privilege came even greater responsibility. The law sought to wall off the elite from the common populace, enforcing a social code where appearance and propriety were matters of life and death. This reveals a society deeply anxious about maintaining public order and moral boundaries, governing even the most ordinary acts with divine consequence. It makes you wonder what other everyday actions carried such a heavy, invisible weight. From the public terror of Mesopotamian law, we journey to the intensely private dominion of the Roman household. Here, the ultimate authority was not a distant king or a stone monument, but the father. The legal principle of Patria Potestas, meaning the power of the father, was the bedrock of Roman family life for centuries. This was not a simple matter of parental discipline. It was an absolute, lifelong power that a man held over his children, both sons and daughters. From the moment of birth, a child was subject to their father's legal dominion, a power that extended far into their adulthood. A father could force his son to divorce a wife he disapproved of. He could disinherit a daughter for defying his wishes, and in the most extreme expression of this authority, Roman law granted the Paterfamilias the right to sell his children into slavery, or even to order their execution. Imagine a grown man, a decorated soldier or a respected merchant, who could still be legally put to death by his own father for bringing dishonor to the family name. The law required no trial, no jury, and no oversight from the state. The family was seen as a miniature kingdom, and the father was its undisputed sovereign. His word was the final law within its walls. While historical records suggest that such brutal measures were likely rare, reserved for the most extreme cases of betrayal or disobedience, their very possibility cast a long shadow. The knowledge of this absolute power shaped every interaction, every decision, and every ambition within the Roman home. It was a system that placed the reputation and continuity of the family unit above the autonomy of any single member. This starkly reminds us that the concept of individual rights, so central to our modern world, was virtually non-existent in this ancient context. The family was the individual, and its honor was the highest law. How did such absolute power shape the minds of those who lived under it? And what does it say about a society that vested life and death decisions in a single man's hands, while a Roman father's power ended at his own doorstep? The Athenian state wielded a life and death authority over every citizen's dinner table. In classical Athens, a simple merchant ship loaded with grain could become an instrument of capital punishment. The city had passed a law making it a crime, punishable by death, to export grain or any other foodstuffs beyond its borders. This was not a minor regulation. It was a desperate and brutal strategy for survival. Athens was a powerhouse of philosophy and democracy, but it could not feed itself. Its rocky soil was unsuitable for large-scale grain farming, forcing the city to import massive quantities from fertile regions like the Black Sea. This constant reliance on foreign food created a deep, persistent anxiety. The government lived in fear of a supply cut off, a bad harvest abroad, or a merchant fleet lost at sea. In such a fragile system, a single greedy trader could trigger a catastrophe. If a merchant were allowed to buy up local grain and ship it to a neighboring state offering a higher price, the price in Athens would skyrocket. The poor would be priced out of the market, and famine would soon follow. So the state intervened with the most powerful tool it had, the threat of execution. This law transformed a basic economic activity into an act of treason against the community. It placed the collective need for food security above an individual's right to profit, a stark contrast to our modern ideas of free trade. The very survival of the city, with all its art and learning, depended on controlling this one vital resource. It makes you realize how thin the line was between civilization and collapse, a line drawn in the sand by a law that treated a sack of grain with the same seriousness as a drawn sword. Yet even the rigid control of the Athenian grain supply pales before a Spartan policy of calculated terror. Sparta's legendary military society was propped up by a deeply unsettling legal institution, the Crypteia. As the final, brutal phase of the agode training, select young Spartan men were sent out from their barracks with a chilling mandate. They were to disappear into the countryside, living off the land and their wits, but their primary mission was far darker. These youths formed a secret police, authorized by the state to silently murder any helots they found. The helots were the enslaved population, the original inhabitants of the land the Spartans had conquered, and they outnumbered their masters by a staggering margin. This was not random violence. The Crypteia specifically targeted the strongest and most capable helots, those who showed any hint of intelligence, ambition, or leadership potential. It was a systematic campaign of culling, designed to terrorize the enslaved majority and crush any hope of rebellion before it could even form. Think of the psychological impact on both sides. For a young Spartan, this was his final test, a lesson that citizenship was built on bloodshed and that the state's security justified any horror. For the helots, it meant that any stranger in the night could be an assassin, and that to stand out in any way was a death sentence. The freedom of the Spartan warrior, so celebrated in history, was literally built upon this foundation of legalized murder. It reveals a society so paranoid about maintaining its power that it weaponized its own youth, turning them into killers to preserve a way of life defined by oppression. How could a culture so disciplined and orderly also be so brutally ruthless? And what does that say about the true cost of their legendary strength? The sacred could walk on 4 legs in ancient Egypt. While Sparta enforced terror with human weapons, Egypt bestowed legal personhood upon its animals. Under the Ptolemaic dynasty, the killing of a cat, an ibis, or a hawk was not a simple act of cruelty. It was a capital crime, an offense against the state punishable by death. These creatures were not just protected, they were living, breathing extensions of the gods. The cat was the earthly representative of the goddess Bastet, a deity of the home, fertility, and protection. The ibis was linked to Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. To harm one of these animals was to directly assault a god, an act that threatened to unravel the cosmic balance the entire kingdom depended upon. This was no theoretical danger. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus recorded a chilling incident where a Roman visitor to Alexandria accidentally caused the death of a cat. An enraged mob quickly formed, seizing the man and executing him on the spot, despite the desperate pleas of officials sent by the king to save him. The law and the people's will were one. This absolute protection was rooted in a stark, practical theology. The gods controlled the universe, and their favor was not abstract. It was directly linked to the Nile's annual flood. If the gods were angered, the river might not rise, the fields would not be watered, and famine would consume the land. Protecting a sacred cat was, in a very real sense, protecting the harvest. It was a matter of national security. This transforms our understanding of ancient law, revealing a world where the spiritual and the legal were completely fused. A crime against a divine symbol was a crime against the state's very survival, proving that in some societies the most powerful laws were not written for people, but for the gods they served. A man's own face could become a taxable commodity in the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Constantine IX Monomachos, ruling in the 11th century, decreed that any man who wished to wear a beard must pay a special fee directly to the imperial treasury. On the surface, this was a clever scheme to raise revenue from a source no one had thought to tap before, a tax on personal appearance, but the law cut much deeper than simple finance. The emperor was deeply influenced by the clean-shaven styles popular in Western Europe, and he sought to make his court a mirror of that fashionable modernity. A beardless face became a symbol of loyalty and sophistication, a visible sign that one adhered to the emperor's preferred aesthetic. Yet the true political genius of the beard tax lay in its exemption. The Eastern Orthodox clergy, who traditionally grew long beards as a mark of their faith and asceticism, were not required to pay. This single clause transformed a fashion statement into a powerful tool of social division. The emperor, by taxing the beards of laymen, was subtly drawing a line in the sand between his own imperial authority and the influence of the church. A bearded priest was a man of God, while a bearded nobleman was a taxpayer. It was a silent, daily reminder of where the state believed true power resided. This law demonstrates how a government can use the most intimate aspects of life, even the hair on a man's chin, to enforce cultural norms, make a political point, and fund its ambitions. It forces us to ask what seemingly innocent personal choices we make today might be used as instruments of control in a different society. Even a sacred drink required a legal permit in the Aztec world. The Aztecs governed the consumption of alcohol with a terrifying precision. For the vast majority of the population, public drunkenness was not a minor offense. It was a capital crime, an act that could lead to a death sentence. The beverage at the heart of this law was pulque, a fermented drink made from the sap of the megi plant. But pulque was far more than just an intoxicant. It was a sacred substance, a gift from the gods, specifically the goddess Weregild. It was used in religious ceremonies to commune with the divine, a liquid bridge to the spirit world. This sacred status is precisely why its uncontrolled use by the common person was considered so dangerous. The Aztec state was a tightly woven machine of military duty, agricultural labor, and social conformity. A drunk worker could not tend the fields. A drunk soldier could not wield a spear. Widespread public intoxication threatened to unravel the very fabric of their highly disciplined society. Yet this harsh law contained a remarkable and humane exception. Any person who had reached the age of 70 was granted a universal license to drink. They could consume as much pulque as they desired, whenever they wished, with full legal immunity. The logic behind this exemption reveals a society that viewed life in distinct stages. By 70, a person had fulfilled all their obligations. They had raised families, paid taxes, and served in wars or community labor. They were now considered to be moving into a different realm of existence, closer to the ancestors and the gods. Their drunkenness was not seen as social disorder, but as a form of spiritual preparation and a well-earned reward. This law perfectly blends cold pragmatism with deep religious belief, controlling the workforce while honoring the elderly, proving that even the most severe legal codes can contain surprising pockets of nuance and respect. The pursuit of beauty could demand a lifetime of agony in imperial China. A girl, often as young as 5 or 6, would have her feet systematically broken and bound, folding the toes under the sole until the arch snapped and the entire foot was reshaped into a stunted, pointed stump. This was the brutal reality of foot binding, a practice elevated over centuries from a fashion to a near-universal social code. While no single emperor's decree ever mandated it for all, the practice was woven into the legal and cultural fabric through powerful incentives. During the Song dynasty, the imperial court itself became a trendsetter, with small feet celebrated in poetry and art as the ultimate mark of refinement and erotic appeal. This created an unwritten law more powerful than any statute. For a family, binding a daughter's feet was a calculated investment in her future. A girl with perfectly formed golden lotuses could secure a marriage into a wealthy, influential family, bringing status and security to her entire clan. To leave her feet unbound was to condemn her to a life of peasant labor and social disgrace. the law of the land occasionally tried to intervene. Certain Qing dynasty emperors, particularly from the Manchu ethnic group that initially rejected the custom, issued edicts attempting to ban foot binding. But these written laws failed spectacularly against the unwritten rules of society. The practice was so deeply embedded in the very definition of femininity and class that families simply ignored the imperial decrees. A father was not breaking a law for his daughter's benefit. He was following a far more ancient and compelling code, one written in the language of survival, honor, and aesthetic obsession. This reveals a profound truth about how societies govern themselves. The most powerful laws are not always those inscribed on parchment, but the invisible ones carved into tradition, enforced by the silent judgment of neighbors and the relentless pressure to conform. It forces us to wonder what painful, invisible codes we might be obeying today, simply because everyone else does. A man's life had a precise price tag in the Viking world. This was the law of Weregild, a term meaning man payment. In the absence of a centralized state with police and prisons, Norse society developed this system as a brutal form of accounting to maintain order. If one man killed another, the law did not necessarily demand his execution. Instead, it demanded compensation. The killer was legally obligated to pay a fine to the family of his victim, a financial transaction intended to settle the debt of a life. But this was not a one-size-fits-all price. The value of a life was calculated with cold precision on a sliding scale of social status. The murder of a jarl, a nobleman, could cost the killer a fortune in silver, perhaps hundreds of cattle. The killing of a common freeman carried a significantly lower price, and if the victim was a thrall, a slave, the Weregild was paid not to the deceased, but to the slave's owner, and the amount was minuscule, reflecting the low value placed on a non-free life. This meticulous pricing structure reveals a society obsessed with preventing the one thing it could not control, the endless blood feud. Without a king's justice to intervene, a single murder could ignite generations of retaliatory killings, decimating entire clans. The Weregild offered a way out. It gave the victim's family a concrete alternative to vengeance, a heavy purse of silver to restore their lost honor and economic standing. It transformed a passionate, destructive cycle of violence into a cold, negotiable business deal. The system acknowledged that while a life could not be returned, a family's security could be restored. This pragmatic approach to justice forces us to reconsider our own assumptions. Is a legal system that prioritizes social stability and compensation for the living inherently less just than one focused solely on punishing the guilty? The Vikings answered that question not with ideals but with silver scales and the grim calculus of survival. A single silver coin never passed from citizen to state in the Inca Empire, yet every person paid their dues. The currency was labor, and the law that enforced it was the Mita. Every commoner, known as a Hatun runner, owed a mandatory portion of each year to the state, not in crops or crafts but in physical work. This was not a request, it was a non-negotiable legal duty, the very engine that powered one of history's most formidable empires. Men were drafted to haul stones for colossal temples, to carve roads through sheer mountain cliffs, and to build the breathtaking agricultural terraces that cling to the Andes. Women could be called upon for state-sponsored weaving or food production. The system was ruthlessly efficient, a vast human network managed through knotted strings called quippers, which recorded who had served and who was still obligated. The philosophical justification was deeply rooted in the Inca worldview. The Sapa Inca, the emperor, was a living god, and the state was his divine embodiment. Therefore, labor for the state was not servitude. It was a sacred act, a collective effort to maintain the cosmic order and ensure the gods' continued favor. Your work on a terrace was a prayer for rain. Your effort on a road was an act of unity that bound the empire together. This law transformed the monumental into the mundane, enabling the construction of Machu Picchu and a 25,000-mile road system without money, wages, or a market economy. But this collective glory came at a steep personal cost. When the Mita call came, you had to leave your own fields, your family, and your home for months. Your survival and your community's well-being depended on your own harvest, yet the state demanded your body first. It was a system that left almost no room for individual ambition or dissent, mobilizing an entire population for projects they did not own, under a law they could not refuse. How does a society balance such breathtaking collective achievement against the silent surrender of personal freedom? The Incas answered with stone and sweat, building an empire on a law that considered every citizen a single, indispensable thread in a divine tapestry. A pig could stand trial for murder. In the ancient Hittite kingdom, the law saw no distinction between a criminal man and a deadly animal. If an ox gored a person to death or a pig caused a fatal injury, the legal response was swift and severe. The animal itself was executed. This was more than just pest control. It was a formal judicial act. The creature was deemed morally culpable for the life it had taken, and its carcass was then treated as ritually unclean, forbidden to be eaten by anyone in the community. This principle, known to later legal scholars as Deodand, extended even to inanimate objects. If a poorly built wall collapsed and killed a passerby, that wall was put on trial. It was ritually dismantled, its stones scattered, as if the community was dismantling the guilt itself. This seems utterly irrational to a modern mind, but for the Hittites, it was a profound necessity. They lived in an animistic world, a place where spirits and agency resided not just in people, but in animals, trees, and stones. A death, especially a sudden and violent one, was not just a physical event. It was a spiritual wound on the community, a source of miasma, or ritual pollution that could offend the gods and bring down further misfortune. By formally condemning and destroying the offending object, whether a pig or a wall, the law performed a public act of purification. It surgically removed the source of the spiritual stain, restoring balance and order. The law was not concerned with the intent of the ox, which had none, but with the consequence of its action. Responsibility was attached to the thing that caused the harm, a tangible focus for the community's need for justice and cleansing. This bizarre legal concept reveals a world where the line between the physical and the spiritual was invisible, and where every tragedy demanded a ritual response to keep the very fabric of reality from unraveling. Blood and honor had a very specific meeting place in medieval Iceland. When two men had a dispute over property or an insult, the law offered a path to resolution far more direct than a courtroom debate. This was the holmgang, a formal duel governed by a code of rules so intricate they bordered on the absurd. The fight itself was confined to a small square of ox hide laid upon the ground, a space so limited that combatants were virtually on top of each other. The regulations were obsessed with containment, with keeping the violence strictly within its designated bounds. If a single drop of a fighter's blood fell onto the earth outside that square, he was immediately declared the loser, regardless of how well he was fighting. The duel was not necessarily to the death. In fact, the first man to draw blood from his opponent's torso was often declared the victor, the dispute considered legally settled. This transformed a brutal fight into a highly structured performance of justice, where a minor wound could carry more legal weight than a killing blow. What is perhaps most surprising is that the law permitted substitution. If a person was too old, too ill, or simply felt he was not a skilled enough fighter, he could legally hire a champion to take his place on the ox hide. A quarrel over a stolen sheep could be settled by two professional duelists who had no personal stake in the matter, turning a matter of honor into a paid service. This bizarre system reveals a society trying to thread a very difficult needle. It acknowledged the deep-seated cultural need for personal vengeance and honor, but it sought to channel that destructive impulse into a controlled, predictable ritual. The holmgang was not lawless chaos. It was law as chaos, carefully managed and bound by procedure. It makes you wonder if our own courtrooms, with their arguments and objections, are simply a much quieter, more civilized version of the same primal need to have a conflict decisively settled on a field of battle, even if that battlefield is now made of wood and leather rather than blood and ox hide. A single stray curl could land a man in the stocks. In the rigid world of 17th century Massachusetts, the Puritan leadership declared war on long hair, specifically targeting men who dared to wear their locks in a fashion they labeled indecent and effeminate. This was not a matter of personal taste. It was a legally enforced moral code, with violators facing fines or public whippings. The Puritans saw the human body as a vessel for sin, and personal adornment was a flashing signal of vanity and pride, the very enemies of a humble, godly life. A man's carefully styled hair was not just a hairstyle. It was a declaration of self, an act of individual expression that threatened the fragile uniformity of their new society. They had crossed an ocean to build a perfect religious community, a city upon a hill, and they believed that external conformity was the necessary shell for internal piety. By legally mandating short, unadorned hair for men, they were attempting to strip away the markers of class and vanity that had plagued English society. In their view, controlling the outward appearance was the first step to controlling the sinful heart within. This law reveals the terrifying flip side of utopian idealism, where the dream of a perfect society justifies the invasion of the most intimate personal choices. It forces us to consider a difficult question: how much of our own personal expression, from our clothing to our hairstyles, is truly free, and how much is silently dictated by the unwritten laws of our own communities, enforced not by whips, but by social approval and disapproval. A collapsing house could legally claim the life of the builder's own child. Hammurabi's code addresses shoddy construction with one of history's most chilling examples of vicarious punishment. The law was precise in its terrible symmetry. If a builder erected a house that fell and killed the homeowner, the builder himself was to be executed. But if the collapse killed the homeowner's son, then the law demanded the life of the builder's son. This was not a random act of cruelty. It was a calculated legal doctrine rooted in a worldview where the family, not the individual, was the fundamental unit of society. Your identity and your legal responsibility were inseparable from your bloodline. A crime was a stain on the entire household, and justice required a payment in kind from the same source. From a purely practical standpoint, the law created the most powerful incentive for quality control imaginable. A builder would not merely risk his reputation or his finances. He was gambling with the lives of those he loved most. Every stone set, every beam placed, was done with the knowledge that a single error could bring his family's ruin. This brutal logic reveals a legal philosophy obsessed with deterrence and collective responsibility. The state did not have vast inspectorates or complex liability courts. It placed the burden of safety directly onto the craftsman and his lineage, making the consequences of failure so horrifying that no builder would dare cut corners. While this seems barbaric to our modern sense of individual justice, it perfectly reflected the interconnected reality of ancient life. Your son was your legacy, your future, and your greatest vulnerability. By making him the potential price for failure, the law struck at the very heart of a man's existence, ensuring that the walls of Babylon were built to last. A person's very existence could be legally defined as filth in feudal Japan. The Ita caste lived under a regime of codified untouchability, their status as hereditary outlaws passed down through generations. The law did not merely discriminate against them, it declared them permanently and irreversibly polluted by the work their ancestors had performed. Their occupations, which included butchering animals, tanning leather, and serving as executioners, were considered necessary for society to function. Yet the people who performed these tasks were treated as human refuse, their touch believed to defile the purity of others. The legal restrictions were designed to make their invisible pollution constantly visible. Ita were forced to live in designated, segregated villages on the outskirts of towns. They were forbidden from marrying anyone outside their own caste, ensuring the stain of their blood would not spread. When they entered a commoner's shop, they were required by law to identify themselves immediately. Some edicts even dictated the specific, humble clothing they must wear and demanded they abandon their sandals and bow deeply when passing a member of the samurai class. The most chilling legal fiction was the value placed on an Ita's life. If a samurai killed one, it was often treated as a minor offense, equivalent to the destruction of property rather than the taking of a human life. The law had effectively dehumanized them, transforming living people into a permanent underclass whose sole purpose was to absorb the society's impurities. This was not an informal social bias, it was a meticulously detailed legal architecture built to justify economic exploitation and maintain a rigid social order. How does a society come to write such cruel prejudice into its very laws? And what does it say about the power of legal codes to not just reflect hatred, but to sanctify it for centuries? Even the chains of servitude had an expiration date in the cradle of civilization. The legal codes of ancient Sumer, particularly those of King Ur-Nammu, codified a brutal but bounded financial reality. If a man fell into debt he could not repay, the law offered a stark solution. He, and often his entire family, could be legally surrendered to the creditor as debt slaves. Their labor became the currency to pay off the obligation. This was a world without modern bankruptcy courts, where your own body could serve as collateral. Yet within this harsh system lay a remarkable and progressive limitation. The law explicitly stated that this period of enslavement could not exceed 3 years. When that term was complete, the debtor was to be freed, and the slate wiped clean, the debt considered fully paid in full. Imagine the psychological impact of that calendar, the slow countdown of seasons for a man working in another's fields. This was not an act of mercy, but a calculated piece of economic policy. The Sumerian lawmakers understood that a citizen trapped in perpetual servitude was lost to the state forever. He could not pay taxes, serve in the militia, or contribute to the community. By mandating a release, the law ensured that even the most destitute members of society had a path back to citizenship, preventing the creation of a permanent, disenfranchised underclass. It was a primitive form of bankruptcy protection, a recognition that the health of the entire economy depended on the circulatory flow of its people, not their permanent enslavement. This 3-year rule represents a profound legal compromise, balancing the creditor's right to recover a loss with the debtor's fundamental right to a future. It reveals a society already grappling with the complex equation between financial justice and human dignity, embedding a sliver of economic logic within an otherwise unforgiving framework. How many other ancient laws contained such quiet, calculated seeds of long-term societal preservation hidden within their immediate brutality? A sultan's most loyal soldiers were stolen from their mother's arms. The Devshirme system, a law of the Ottoman Empire, functioned as a human tax levied upon its Christian subjects in the Balkans. Imperial officers would periodically arrive in villages with a quota, selecting the most promising boys, typically between the ages of 8 and 18. These children were permanently taken from their families, their names changed, their faith converted to Islam, and their entire previous lives erased. For the conquered populations, this was a form of legalized terror, a recurring nightmare that could visit any household. The grief of a community losing its sons was the direct cost of this imperial policy. Yet from the perspective of the Ottoman state, this was a masterstroke of political engineering. These boys, cut off from their ancestral ties and loyalties, were molded into the empire's most formidable instrument, the Janissary Corps. They underwent years of grueling physical and intellectual training, emerging as elite soldiers and administrators bound by a single allegiance to the Sultan himself. This system cleverly neutralized the threat of powerful noble families vying for power, as these slave soldiers owed everything to the state and had no competing family agendas. The law transformed the children of the empire's subjects into the enforcers of its will, a paradox where the very source of a community's sorrow became the backbone of imperial stability. It was a brutal form of assimilation that also functioned as a perverse meritocracy, where a peasant's son could rise to the highest ranks of power, provided he first surrendered his entire identity. How does a society reconcile such breathtaking opportunity with such profound personal loss? And what does it say about the nature of power when it is built upon the systematic repurposing of human lives? A creditor's most powerful weapon could be his own empty stomach. Early Celtic Ireland refined this principle into a formal legal ritual, the practice of troscad or fasting upon. When a person was wronged, perhaps cheated out of a prized ox or denied a rightful inheritance, and the legal system failed them, they had one final, profound recourse. They would travel to the home of the person who had harmed them and sit at their doorstep, publicly refusing all food and drink. This was not a simple hunger strike. It was a sacred act, a legal procedure that compelled the debtor to join the fast. Both parties were now locked in a grim contest of wills, their shared starvation a public performance of the unresolved dispute. The entire community watched, and the pressure was immense. For the debtor to refuse to fast was a grave dishonor, an admission of guilt that would lead to complete social ostracism. His name would be blackened, his credit ruined, and he might be shunned in business and in worship. The spiritual stakes were even higher. In a culture that saw fasting as a way to invoke divine judgment, the debtor risked attracting the wrath of the gods themselves if he let the plaintiff suffer. The plaintiff's body became the ultimate legal instrument, his physical decline a ticking clock counting down to the debtor's social and spiritual ruin. This bizarre law transformed passive suffering into active power, weaponizing shame and faith to settle disputes without a single blow being struck. It reveals a society where public opinion and spiritual fear were more potent than any constable's sword, a world where justice could be served not by taking a life, but by refusing to sustain your own. The speed of an empire was measured in hoofbeats and legal privilege. Across the sprawling Achaemenid Persian Empire, a web of roads connected distant provinces, but the royal road was its absolute sovereign. A specific law transformed this artery of trade and travel into a lifeline of power, granting the king's messengers an unchallengeable right of way. Any merchant's caravan, any noble's procession, any farmer's cart was required to scramble out of the path the moment one of these imperial couriers was sighted. Their urgency was the law's highest priority, but this right of way was only the beginning. To maintain their blistering pace, these messengers held a legal right that pierced the very heart of private property. They could demand a fresh horse from any stable, food from any kitchen, and a bed from any home along their route. Refusal was not an option, for the courier carried the authority of the king himself. The Greek historian Herodotus recorded the stunning efficiency of this system, noting that a message could travel the entire length of the royal road, over 1,600 miles from Susa to Sardis, in just 7 days. This was a speed unmatched until the age of the steam engine. Every fresh horse seized from a local was a sacrifice for imperial unity. Every meal commandeered a private cost for public security. This law created an ancient superhighway where state information moved faster than anyone or anything else, binding a vast and diverse empire together with the relentless rhythm of its royal post. It reveals a profound truth about control, demonstrating that the most powerful empires governed not just through armies and decrees, but through the sheer, legally enforced velocity of a single spoken word. Centuries later, and a world away from the Hittites, English common law was still putting carts on trial. The medieval Deodand Law declared that any object causing a fatal accident was itself guilty. If a runaway horse trampled a pedestrian, the horse was forfeit. If a mill wheel crushed a worker, the wheel was seized. The law treated these items not as mere property, but as culpable agents of death. The term Deodand literally means given to God, and that is precisely what happened. The condemned object was taken by the crown, sold, and the money was given to the king, who was expected to distribute the proceeds as alms, a financial penance to atone for the life lost. This applied even to massive, valuable objects. Court records detail cases where an entire ship that wrecked and drowned a sailor was legally declared a Deod, and its value handed over to the authorities. The logic seems baffling for a society that was building universities and charters of rights, yet it persisted for centuries, only being fully abolished in the 1840s. This longevity reveals a deep, almost subconscious layer of ancient animism surviving within the sophisticated structure of English law. It was a legal fossil, a remnant of a world where spirits resided in objects and a tragic death demanded a tangible sacrifice to restore spiritual balance. The community needed a focus for its outrage and its grief, a thing to blame and to destroy, or in this case, to monetarily sacrifice. The Deod, and was that focus, a bizarre but deeply human attempt to answer the unanswerable question of why bad things happen to innocent people, by pinning the blame on the nearest inanimate object. It forces us to wonder what seemingly rational laws we obey today might, in a few centuries, be viewed as the relics of our own unexamined superstitions. A city's collective fear could find its focus in a single, broken body. Ancient Greece perfected this psychological alchemy in the ritual of the Pharmakos, a practice that straddled the line between sacred rite and social law. When plague descended or famine gripped the city, the citizens of Athens and other polis did not turn to doctors or economists alone. They turned to a ritual of expulsion. The community would select an individual, almost always someone from the margins, a person deemed physically ugly, crippled, or devastatingly poor. This person was designated the scapegoat, the human vessel for the city's pollution. The process was chillingly ceremonial. First, the chosen one was paraded through the streets, but not as a prisoner. They were ritually fed and treated with a strange, temporary reverence, as if being prepared for a sacred duty. This feeding was not an act of compassion. It was a symbolic act of loading the scapegoat with the community's collective sustenance, literally filling them with the life of the city they were about to carry away. Then the ritual reached its brutal climax. The crowd would beat the individual with fig branches and wild onions, driving them beyond the city walls into the wilderness, a symbolic act of purging the community's sickness and sin. In some accounts, the Pharmakos was not just exiled but killed, their death serving as the ultimate catharsis. This was not mob violence. It was a sanctioned, religiously mandated social code, a legalized mechanism for managing collective terror. The logic was perversely elegant. By blaming a single, vulnerable person for catastrophes, no one could control disease, drought, bad luck. The community could restore a sense of order and agency. They transformed an abstract, overwhelming crisis into a tangible problem with a simple, brutal solution. The Pharmakos became a living sacrifice to the city's need for control, a human lightning rod for misfortune. This ritual reveals a dark undercurrent in the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, a reminder that even the most enlightened societies can legally channel their darkest fears onto the most powerless among them. What does it say about us that our most ancient response to shared suffering is so often to find someone to blame and to cast them out? These 21 bizarre laws, scattered across continents and centuries, are not just a collection of random curiosities. When you step back, powerful patterns emerge from the chaos, revealing the fundamental anxieties and priorities of the ancient world. The most dominant thread is the unbreakable bond between religion and law. For the Aztecs, drinking pulque was a sacred act that required legal control. For the Hittites, a murderous ox was not just a dangerous animal, but a source of spiritual pollution that demanded a ritual trial. Their legal codes were not separate from their cosmology. They were its direct expression, designed to maintain a fragile cosmic balance that could be shattered by a single impious act. A second, relentless theme is the crushing weight of the collective. The needs of the community, the state, or the empire almost always trumped individual liberty. The Inca Mita system mobilized entire populations for state projects, treating each citizen as a vital yet expendable thread in a divine tapestry. The Athenian grain ban made exporting food a capital crime, placing the city's survival far above a merchant's right to profit. This was not a world that celebrated the individual. It was a world that demanded sacrifice for the whole, and to enforce that sacrifice, law became the primary tool for rigid social control. From the absolute power of the Roman Paterfamilias over his family to the codified untouchability of Japan's Ita caste, legal systems meticulously constructed and policed social hierarchies. Your place in society was not just a matter of custom, it was a matter of law, dictating who you could marry, where you could live, and even the value of your life. Finally, we see a stark, unsentimental pragmatism at work. The goal was not necessarily fairness in our modern sense, but stability and deterrence. The Viking Weregild system sought to stop blood feuds by putting a precise price on a man's life. Hammurabi's code demanded a builder's son be killed if his shoddy work caused the death of the homeowner's son, creating the most terrifying quality control incentive imaginable. These were not acts of random cruelty. They were calculated solutions to dire problems. Our ancestors were not irrational barbarians. They were practical people, building walls against chaos with the only materials they had: sacred tradition, collective obligation, and often brutal logic. Their strange laws were answers to the eternal human questions of how to live together, how to please the gods, and how to simply survive. What answers, then, are we writing into our own laws today? And what will future generations find so bizarre about the rules we take for granted? Our journey through these 21 forgotten statutes reveals a world where justice wore 1,000 different masks. We have traveled from the taverns of Mesopotamia to the mountain roads of the Inca, from the sacred cats of Egypt to the terrified helots of Sparta. We saw laws that priced a man's life in Viking silver, that forced a father to gamble with the life of his own son in Babylon, and that legally declared a human being to be filth in feudal Japan. The sheer strangeness of these codes can feel overwhelming, a parade of the alien and the brutal. Yet within every one of these laws, from the capital crime of exporting Athenian grain to the sacred license for an elderly Aztec to drink, there beats a pulse of desperate logic. These were not the random edicts of madmen. They were the calculated responses of societies grappling with the same fundamental questions we face today. How do we keep the peace? How do we honor the divine? How do we ensure the harvest comes in and the community survives? Their answers were forged in the fires of their own unique realities, a fusion of spiritual belief, social necessity, and raw, unsentimental pragmatism. Our own laws against theft, murder, and fraud are the direct descendants of these ancient struggles, even if our methods have softened. We no longer put a pig on trial for murder, but we still seek to assign blame and find closure when tragedy strikes. We no longer demand a father's absolute power over his children, but we still debate the boundaries of parental rights and state intervention. The context changes, but the human yearning for order, for meaning, and for control remains a constant. So the next time you read about a new regulation or debate a point of law, remember the bizarre tapestry of our shared legal past. It serves as a powerful mirror, reminding us that our own sense of justice is not a fixed point, but a story still being written. Which of these ancient laws struck you as the most shocking or the most profoundly strange? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this journey into the heart of historical mystery, be sure to subscribe for more explorations of our forgotten past.